So we're rescheduling a bit. We're actually going back. We, at one point, had the idea of maybe it'd be nice to have a kind of an overview of what's been happening in economics and particularly related to inequality and the themes of the projects in South Africa and Ghana. And that's a paper that we were going to present tomorrow, but we're going to do it now. And I want to link it to a little bit of the history of the collaborations that were mentioned between Michigan and Cape Town, and then how those have evolved to build up connections to Ghana, and talk a little bit about how some of the training collaborations we've done have interacted and really helped advance some of the research collaborations. And then we'll get into the substantive issues that we've been focusing on about what's been going on in poverty and inequality in South Africa and Ghana, and how is it related to economic growth. So collaborations between economists at Michigan and economists at Cape Town began around 1996, and I was involved in that, and Murray was involved in that, and we've been very happily involved ever since in lots of collaborative activities. Training became important almost from the outset. I did a sabbatical at UCT in 97, 98, and we started talking about some training activities. We did a number of things. We got some funding from the Mellon Foundation and another Fogarty grant. Tom mentioned his Fogarty grant. We also had a Fogarty grant. And we brought people to Michigan. A lot of them came for our summer training programs in the Institute for Social Research. People just came for other kinds of collaborations. And then we started developing a summer 2-week STATA course, South African summer, January summer, at UCT. We got some funding from the Mellon Foundation and used this Fogarty funding and other sources. Eventually this evolved into a very nice grant from the Kresge Foundation that UCT has now to keep it going. So it started in 1999. It's been going ever since, and it's trained many people from South Africa and from neighboring countries in statistical analysis of survey data using the statistical package STATA. It's always been sort of heavily built around STATA. Along the same time, we were very interested in research collaborations as well, and I got interested in working in South Africa because of interest in inequality, really. I'd worked a lot in Brazil previously, and got to Cape Town and discovered that Murray and Francis Wilson and many other of the economists at UCT were very interested in poverty and inequality, and then I started meeting people like Dory at UKZN with similar interests. There's quite a impressive, great group of economists in South Africa interested in kind of microeconomic issues related to labor markets and poverty and inequality. So I got very drawn in, and these research interests were really, I think, very much facilitated, sort of getting acquainted and talking about, maybe we should do a project on this and that, and starting to write some papers, actually by the training programs as well, because we would go down, and Jim Levinson and other people from here would go to Cape Town to do the training, and it really helped, I think, facilitate actually the research interests, and they're really going back and forth. The training was in turn very much influenced by our research interests, so the training, reflects, we spend a lot of time looking at things like poverty and inequality. On the research side, this led to a very exciting project. You've already heard one paper based on it from Cecil, the Cape Area Panel Study. We applied successfully to the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Institute on Child Health and Human Development, NICHD, and got actually 2 overlapping grants, pretty large, nice 5-year grants, to do CAPS. And it started out we were going to do 2 waves, and then we got some supplemental funding, and eventually it's turned into 5 waves, and we're probably done, but you never know. I thought we were done after wave 3, and then I thought we were done after wave 4, and as anybody in Michigan knows, once you start these panel studies, they tend to never die, which is good, I guess. Anyway, this CAPS was a big success, and The data is all publicly available. UCT shares with Michigan a very strong commitment to public access to data. So these data sets, to the amazement of many people, are put up on the web for anyone to download within, usually within a year, or sometimes faster than that, of data collection. This is just examples of us out doing field work in Khayelitsha. So it's a very, very interesting project. And then, unrelated, and I think in some ways growing out of what we did with CAPS, UCT developed a lot of capacity in doing survey research. The presidency decided they wanted to start a national income dynamics study, a longitudinal study related to poverty and income dynamics. They went to Murray. Murray has been the director of this project. And so they now have 3 waves of outstanding longitudinal data, really the first real nationally representative longitudinal survey, certainly in South Africa, probably in Africa. It's certainly that's going on already for 3 waves and 4th wave already planned. They get the data out amazingly fast, so the 3rd wave has already been put up. It was just done in 2012. It's already publicly available. You could download it while you're sitting here if you get bored with the talk and start playing with it. It's absolutely great data. So that's what happened with NIDS, and then we got so ASRI came along, and we were interested in these interactions between Ghana and South Africa and Michigan, and I didn't really know any economists in Ghana. Murray had some previous connections, but I think ASRI, we had the conference in Cape Town, then we had the conference in Accra. We gradually got to meet people, and we decided to take this training course that we'd done in Cape Town and see if it would be useful in Ghana. So we developed in 2011, very much with the support of Kofi, a STATA course at University of Cape Coast that we did for 2 weeks, and some of the PhD students here, Laura Zimmerman, Johannes Norling, came along on that trip, and along with some others. We had a great time. It was a very, very interesting course. We had and Sam, our co-presenter here today, was also very important, a member of the teaching crew for that course. And it was very fun, very successful. We had participants. We had almost 60 people from a wide variety of institutions. There we are sitting at the computer labs. This is very hands-on, and at the computer all day basically for 2 weeks. And we sort of start assuming they don't know anything about the package, which in most cases is true, and then proceed to teach up to a pretty high level. And by end of 2 weeks, we're doing, fairly sophisticated regressions and data analysis. And there was Kofi and Murray and I giving out certificates, and that was great. And that was that first course. Then the next year we went back to Cape Coast again. And then this year we went to University of Ghana and began to work with people there, still in collaboration with Cape Coast, and Sam was there again. And so Abena was really the ringleader there, and her colleagues, Louis, who's here, and Nkechi, who's here, and William Baboating, who isn't here. But great group, and I think one of the points I want to make is that by doing a course like this, over the course of a week or two, you spend a lot of time with these colleagues, and you hear them talk about the things they're working on and teaching and learning about the data sets. And as Murray was saying before, you actually know something about Ghana because you've been teaching Ghanaian data. I mean, very superficially, of course, but you start to learn about the data sets and get quite interested and develop relationships with these fantastic colleagues. And so that was very nice. We did that in July and August of this year, and there's a photo from that event. So I just want to make the point that this I think, is a very nice way to build some collaborations. And so we met Sam on this first course in 2011 and got to learn about his work. And, you know, I guess not surprisingly, turns out lots of people are interested in similar things. Poverty and inequality are a subject of considerable interest in Ghana, as we've already learned, and we'll learn more from as we heard Louis' paper, we'll hear Abina's paper, and Sam will be talking about some of the work he's been involved in. So very nice to compare notes and talk about, you know, what are the issues in Ghana, what are the issues in South Africa, what kinds of data do you have? And so we started talking, you know, could we do some comparative work, and especially with this conference in mind? You know, what can we learn by comparing what's been happening in South Africa, what's been happening in Ghana? So it's a work in progress. I'd say, you know, we're finding our way and finding challenges in terms of how the data sets work, what the issues are. We'll talk a little bit about that, but we're also finding some, you know, interesting points of comparison. So I'll dive into the first part of what we began to do, and then let Sam and Murray talk about kind of the specific cases. So the question we wanted to ask is, how has economic growth affected poverty and inequality in Ghana and South Africa? They both had positive economic growth over the last 20 years or so. We're kind of going back to the early 90s in both cases. These are just World Bank sort of data, and you can see the growth rates here. Ghana has had these spectacular growth rates here in the last few years, partly from oil and partly from other commodities and partly just from being a good, well-run country, I think. And like a lot of African countries, having you know, pretty impressive economic growth. So up to, you know, 5, 6, even 10% growth. South Africa in the 90s looked, you know, a little bit less impressive, and then has been hurt more by the crisis and has definitely slowed. So there's, you know, some difference there, and we'll talk about the importance of that in terms of the outcomes we're looking at. So here's some differences in GDP. South Africa, of course, considerably richer country than Ghana. South Africa, you know, truly middle-income country for a while, getting to sort of a high middle-income country, $7,300 per capita GDP in purchasing power parity in '93, and has risen to just under 10,000. And Ghana has been growing even faster, with the gap narrowing somewhat. But still, you know, South Africa definitely a higher income country with a sort of a different set of issues to some degree, but a lot of similarities as well. So there you can see that graphically what those look like. A pretty big gap, but South Africa slowing down and Ghana speeding up. Just the growth rates again. Okay, so I just want to show one slide here about inequality, and then I'll turn it over to Sam to talk about some specific issues in Ghana about poverty and inequality. So it's you know, one of the measures of inequality that's probably easiest for everybody to get their heads around. It's just the share of income going to each of the income deciles. So what share of income does the bottom 10% get? What share of income does the top 10% get? This is South Africa in 1993. You can see extremely unequal country. South Africa has had one of the most extreme income inequality levels in the world for some time. So on the eve of the change of government in '94, a big survey was done by Murray's Center, who played the lead role in it, Saldrew. And the Gini coefficient was 0.68, which would be, you know, pretty much the highest in the world. Maybe Brazil at that time would have been competing, in a few other smaller countries. But then this is using per capita household income. So this is an income-based measure of inequality. So you can see the share going to the top 10% of something like 55% of income going to the top 10%. That's that would be one of the highest in the world as well. And then you can see what it looks like for the other deciles. There is actually some money going to the bottom 10%, but it's so low you can't even see it. It looks like zero, practically is zero. So extremely skewed inequality. So what happened between 93 and 2008? That's sort of our first question, and the answer is inequality went up. You can see it in the Gini coefficient. That's here, that's not working, of 0.69, but just slightly. That's barely changed. Now, there's many ways to measure inequality, and the answer here depends a little on which way you do it. You can see here, if you use this share to the top 10%, inequality definitely went up. And this is going to be the basic pattern, and as many of you know, this is a pattern across many developing countries that have had economic growth, is that the growth has gone disproportionately to the high-income groups. This is Ghana. Ghana has much lower inequality, a Gini coefficient of 0.55, that top 10% getting a little over 40%. Of course, that's still very unequal, but by international standards, that's just kind of, you know, run-of-the-mill inequality, just kind of about average inequality. But it went up, and it went up quite a lot. So Ghana, which has had this impressive economic growth, has had that economic growth benefit high-income groups more than low-income groups. And of course, this would be true in India and China and many countries that have had economic growth. It's not unusual. Although we do have the interesting case of Brazil and some of the Latin American countries where inequality has actually begun to decline. So this is sort of the first point, is that we have this very common thread, which in many ways is typical of the African pattern for those countries that have had economic growth, that growth has tended to benefit the top more than the bottom. So I'm going to turn it over to Sam to talk a little bit more about inequality, and then we'll get to the issue of what has happened to poverty, which will be our other big question.
Thank you, David. I think the critical question here is what is driving the increase in inequality. The earlier slides that David showed was pointing to increasing growth both in terms of GDP and per capita income for both Ghana and South Africa. But then he presents us with this gloomy picture which shows that over the period, both in South Africa and Ghana, there is increasing inequality. So what I'm going to do is to walk you through the sources of inequality and look at the case specifically for Ghana and shift over to other spaces where we look at inequality, especially from the finance point of view, and ended off with the poverty situation in Ghana. Then Mario will pick it up from there. Okay, so on this slide, what we try to show is regional inequality based on the 3 rounds of the survey. My colleague Louis talked about the Ghana Living Standard Survey earlier on, and this is just trying to tell us, to show us a sense of whether the increase in inequality is as a result of decomposition based on regional inequality or giving another group of inequality, let's say rural, urban, or ecological zones. So if you look at this slide, it's difficult to say in terms of what is really driving it. The big pushers is what is happening in Greater Accra region and the 3 northern regions. But the big push is what you see in Greater Accra region when in 1998 it was about 0.3, and 2005, 2006 it moves up to about 0.41. So Greater Accra, those of us not familiar with Ghana, is the national capital, but you cannot make a big case out of it. It has the lowest incidence of poverty, but in terms of inequality, you realize that the 3 northern regions that are the poorest regions, some of them are also recording a big push in inequality, for especially in the case of Upper East and Upper West, where you see that inequality moves up from 0.32 to 0.4, and for Upper East and for Upper West, it moves from 0.32 to 0.41. So from a regional point of view, you cannot really make a case as to whether it is the poorer regions that are driving inequality up or it's the better off regions that are driving inequality.
Sam, you might point out this is expenditures. So
okay. Okay. Yeah, thanks, David. So what David showed to us earlier on had to do with per capita household income. And what we show here is consumption expenditure. So you realize that the inequality there changes. So traditionally, inequality at the expenditure level is much lower than inequality based on income. So given that we do not observe much differences at the regional level, we take a second step to look at what happens in terms of rural-urban inequality. And what we see here is, here we plotted against poverty headcount and consumption inequality, but we're going to put emphasis on the blue bars, which has to do with consumption inequality, because that is the focus now. So if you look at what happens in terms of rural for 1998 and rural for 2005, in terms of the blue bars, you realize that it was 0.34 in 1998 and moved up by 0.03 in 2005. Whereas in the urban areas, it was 0.33 in 1998 and moved up to 0.38 in 2005. So this begins to tell us that maybe it is the rural-urban inequality that is driving the national inequality. So we take the third step that allows us to use a measure that calculates the different sources of inequality, and that is the Thales measure of inequality. And again, given that the measure changes, you're not going to see the same inequality figures that we got when we're using the Gini coefficient. So this gives us a sense of the decomposition by 4 different categories, that is the rural, urban, the ecological zones, the region, and the district. So the main point that we want to emphasize here is what is driving the share of inequality in Ghana. And we don't have the 1991-92 data set, they don't have the district variable, so we are not able to capture it. But in terms of 98 and 2005, what we see is that in terms of share of inequality, the district inequality, and let me explain the share of inequality, it has to do with the share of between inequality. And the total inequality, for instance, if you add 9.8 and 16.1, you get a 25.9. So the within and the between gives you the overall inequality. And the share has to do with only the between inequality. So what is contributing to inequality in both 98 and 2005 is district level inequality. The main point that we take home here is that it is the biggest, but we recognize that it is falling over 1998 and 2005, with slight increasing for within inequality between 1998 and 2005. So what is causing the increase in inequality over these 2 rounds of survey is the within district inequality. But that doesn't mean that it is the big chunk of inequality. The big chunk of inequality is what? The between inequality, the district level inequality that we observed for 1998 and 2005, 2006. So I move away from the space where we use either income and expenditure, and we try to look at inequality or gender discrimination in the context of access to finance. So here, the space that we're measuring inequality is use of financial services. And this is coming from the FinScope data, and the FinScope data is run by FinMark Trust, and for South Africa, this data set is available since 2003 to 2013. Again, once you request for that data set, you're going to get access to it. So it's 11 years, it's not a panel data set, it's a repeated cross-sectional data set. The beauty about this data set is that in all the countries that is rolled out, the same set of questions are asked. So it puts us in a position to do a kind of some comparative analysis. So in Ghana, it has been done once and was done in 2010. So on this slide, what we try to show is that in terms of people's use of financial services, we put them into different types and different levels. So what we mean by types is that different general banking services, investment products, and insurance products. For the sake of time, I'm going to show you the case just for general banking services and insurance, because the patterns for investment and insurance are pretty much about the same. So what we have on the left panel is the case for Ghana, and the first set of bars has to do with females, and the second set of bars has to do with males. So the point that we're honing in is that whereas we see a fairly equal distribution for the case of South Africa, we see great disparity for the case of Ghana in the case of general account and services. And to give you a sense of what makes the distinction between the levels, the deeper lines has to do with either pre or non-account. And in South Africa, in 2004, they introduced what is called the Mizansi account, which was sort of an entry-level account. So once somebody has that, we don't want to classify that as somebody who is really engaged in some form of financial services. The basic, which has to do with the middle one, that is this one, is people who operate accounts like ATMs and so on. And once you move up to the advanced level of general account and services, we are interested in people who enter into overdraft and things like that. So this is what we mean by the levels. So we see that in terms of Ghana, there is about a 7% difference in terms of females and males. So which means that more than half, about 60% of females do not use any form of general account and services, whereas about 52% of males do that. This 7% difference, we don't see that in the case of South Africa, which is about 38% for females and 37% for males. Then on the next slide, what we try to show is the other type of financial service, which is insurance. As I said earlier on, we find pretty much patterns between investment and insurance products. So we do not show that here. And what is striking here is not only in terms of the discrimination, but the extent of deprivation in terms of access to insurance products. So what we see here is that about 6% of females in Ghana do not have any form of insurance product, whereas in South Africa, about 50% of them do have some form of insurance product. So the disparity there in terms of the gender discrimination is not too much of the focus here in terms of not having access, although there's a 6% difference. Whereas what is striking about this case of South Africa is that if you look at the second category, the second level, which has to do with basic insurance products such as funeral products and things like that, females have about 29% of that service, whereas males have about 19%, which means that males engage in some form of insurance product, more females engage in some form of insurance products than their male counterparts. But as we move along to the advanced level of insurance products, males do dominate. So what these slides tell us is that inequality should be looked at, again, as theory posits, in the context of what space are you looking at and what group are you looking at, because this gives us a sense of what is driving the national level inequality. After painting that gloomy picture, at least there's some good side of the story in terms of what is happening with poverty rates in Ghana. So on this slide, what we try to show is that between 1991 and 2005, so this is the poverty incidence, which is about 36.5% in 1991-92. Then down to 2005-2006, Ghana had almost halved poverty between the period. So by 2005, in terms of extreme poverty, there was clear indication that poverty had been halved. Then my last slide, I show you the kernel density poverty incidence in Ghana. So the green bulge is telling us that as at 1991-92, there was high incidence of poverty, as we saw in the previous slide. But the most important point that we highlight here is that, yes, between this and that, it shows a reduction in poverty. But what you see is that the green bar concentrates around the poverty line, which is about roughly more than $1 a day in the case of Ghana. But as we move along over the period to 2005-2006, the curvature flattens out, which is a clear indication of the increasing inequality that we saw earlier on. I think on this note, I'll call on Murray to look at the South Africa situation.
Hopefully you don't have indigestion by now. Feel free to do dessert and stuff. I guess that's the whole idea. So moving now to South Africa and a similar density, which is, what is a density? This is actually using the survey data that we have. Both Ghana and South Africa has really good household surveys over time, and using these data to actually try and estimate what the distribution looks like of, in this case, per capita income in a country. And isn't it, I mean, it's a sort of amazing thing, actually. Don't let the moment pass you by, because you know, in stats classes, you draw a normal distribution or chi-squared or whatever, but what does South Africa actually look like? What does the distribution of income look like? And here it is. And Sam just showed you what Ghana looks like. So we can use these data, and so there's a basis for discussing all the stuff we're discussing. And what do we see about South Africa? Well, we see, to some extent, it's a similar story to Ghana. We see in 1993, I can't even see that, so you certainly can't. The blue guy is 1993, and the red guy is 2008. And you can see a rightward shift, which is good. We put in a poverty line, and one of the problems with comparative work, one of the trickinesses, is that the poverty line in South Africa is about $4 per day. As a sort of it's not a national poverty line established, but it's the sort of poverty line that many of us are using. So you've got to be careful when you're comparing, But nonetheless, you can see an improvement in poverty. Can you? Yeah? Good. Okay. And, but you can see the inequality situation is tricky because there seems to be, it's moved to the right completely in some senses, and so there's people that have done extremely well and pushed the distribution out on the one toe. So that is the South African story. Poverty went down, but marginally, not nearly as strongly as in Ghana. And inequality, as David's shown us already, went up or stayed resiliently high at a very, very high level. So what can we tell you about that? Well, we can draw a diagram that's quite complicated. These are sources of income by income decile. So we picked we divided up the incomes into what is interesting for South Africa. So there's government transfers, which are the grey line. There's remittances, there's capital income, and there's labour income. And what's very, very striking, at the top we've got 1993, at the bottom we've got 2008, and look what happens to the grey section. The grey section is social transfers. So we're looking at the share of income by decile, and you can see a massive increase in the contribution of social transfers, especially at the lower level, but quite a huge change in the components of income that are coming into South African households. And also, something that Dory's worried about a lot in her detailed work is a decline in the contribution from remittances. Can you see that with regard to the green? So you've got this massive increase in social transfers, and you've got a decline in remittances, and you've got labour market income that's not really helping very much, certainly not at the bottom. You can see that it's a declining share of household income at the bottom, and it's still got a very steep gradient. So that shows us, okay, what are the interesting questions in the South African context? The mic was dead, not the speaker. Okay. I'm alive. So this shows you what issues come out as key in the South African context. One is definitely the role of social transfers. The government put in place a massive expansion of social grants over the post-apartheid period, and it's got a feature as part of the story. The decline in remittances, which is sort of private transfers, if you like, is also very important. And then the labour market turns out to be not a very good story in South Africa. It just hasn't supported broad-based transformation, if you like, or more inclusive growth. We'll get back to that. So I just highlight some of those points. Here's another one of these estimated distributions. All that we did here, we took a 2008 distribution and we plotted the distribution that you had before. The 2008 with grants is the same as you saw before. And then we took the grants away. It's a very naive policy exercise, but it's a policy exercise that shows you what the distribution would have looked like if you took the grants away. And you can see this massive movement to the left with the blue graph, which shows you who's getting the grant income for a start. So it's the poor who are getting it, and exactly what happens. So you can see the grants make a massive difference to the whole distribution of income, and there's a lot of work in South Africa exploring that, showing that more or less the entire reduction in poverty is due to the grants, rather than employment creation or something like that. There's another side to the South African government's role, government policy over the post-apartheid period. So social grants is a very, very important story, and it's an amazing story in the sense that government managed to expand social grants within a sustainable budget environment. At the same time, there wasn't a decrease in expenditure on education or on health, and there was a big improvement in access to water, sanitation, fuel meaning fuel for cooking, electricity, and asset indices. This graph, which is a basis for an analysis of what's called multidimensional poverty, just shows you many of the dimensions in which there have been improvements over the post-apartheid period, between 1993 and 2010 in this case. So you can see it's an index of deprivation. So in this case, having more is not a good thing. Okay, so the fact that it's got less in 2010 is a sign of less deprivation. That's how the measure works. But it is a sign of success in a sense of increasing access to things. So years of education, there have been some major improvements that we've spent a lot of time studying. Average years of schooling have gone from around about 0.7 years to 7 years to close to 10 over that time. And you can see the many dimensions in which there's been an improvement. But one of the puzzling issues then in South Africa, I guess, is we've had cash transfers that have alleviated poverty to some extent. We've had many successes on these other fronts, but we haven't had a massive inclusive growth process, if you like, where the reductions in poverty are quite moderate and inequality has gone up. So there's just a simple exercise that we do here around the multidimensional poverty indicator to show the conundrum, in a sense, of South Africa over the post-apartheid years. Look at start at the bottom. What the first column tells you that, according to a multidimensional poverty indicator, the poverty rate in 1993 on this multidimensional index was 0.37. So that's like a head count. So 37% of the population was multidimensionally poor in 1993. That changed to 0.08 in 2010. That's a massive improvement in multidimensional poverty. So we contrived an income exercise, an equivalent exercise, where we set an income poverty line to have 37% of people poor in 1993. By construction, we picked a poverty line, which was quite a low one, actually. And then we said, okay, according to that poverty line, what happened to poverty over the post-apartheid period? And you can see that poverty went from 0.37 to 0.28, which is a decline, and it's not insignificant, but it's nowhere near as significant as on the multidimensional poverty indicator. And you can see that that's pretty much true across the board. We've got a biracial group here. You can see that most South African poverty is actually in the African group. We've got provincial. You can see quite a lot of unevenness across the provinces, but the trend is the same, and a rural-urban. And it all tells the same story. Here's the story. A huge reduction in multidimensional poverty, but less of a reduction in income poverty. And what is the story then? How do you get a situation like that? It's basically a situation in which, if you think about it, we've put a lot of things in place, but we haven't got a return on them. It hasn't turned into increased livelihoods for people. It hasn't turned into increased labor market income. It hasn't generated informal sector enterprises, etc. So I put one slide up just to show you that in any economy, in any country, the labor market has to close these things in a dynamic sense. There's no other way except through employment creation to really get a dynamic process going in a country. And this slide looks at unemployment rates by income deciles and shows you that the labor market hasn't really done the job in South Africa over the post-apartheid years. The unemployment rates, especially at the bottom deciles, have gone up quite dramatically over time. Okay, so I told you a bit of a South African story. Sam and David told you a very nice Ghanaian story. What do we get out of looking at both together, other than doubling the time of the presentation? Well, we've had two. What interested us as we were teaching together and thinking and talking together was that we've had two countries that have had positive growth experiences. Okay, it's very clearly the case that Ghana has grown faster than South Africa. but they've had positive growth experiences. And so in some senses, we've got a situation in which it's worthwhile reflecting on what happened then to inequality and poverty in that situation. So we've got positive growth, Ghana higher than South Africa, but inequality's gone up in both countries. Immediately what comes to mind is, we had another slide, actually. Yeah. So let me rather focus on this slide, just for time. So Ghana's high income growth was key to reducing its poverty, right? It was higher, and it grew faster, and poverty came down. Now, but you can get poverty reduction, but it can be in a disequalizing context. Both Ghana and South Africa had increased inequality. They both had reductions in poverty. South Africa's reduction was much more slight, maybe in line with the much lower growth rate. The South African situation shows some payoffs of redistribution through transfers and public investment in education, in health, in water and sanitation, etc. So there's some payoff. But neither country really had dramatic employment creation that was enough to make the process a very dynamic one over time. Ghana did marginally better. South Africa has done appallingly. And so we get this pattern of marginally inclusive growth. I don't think anybody would say either country has had a highly successful experience of inclusive growth over time. And then we get to many of the detailed papers that are then on the agenda. How do you understand that? Well, now at that point you've got to drill down very deeply, and you've got to start talking about the investments in human capital, in education and health in both countries. And are they really working? And we had some really good papers in the first session today on both countries about that. Because you can increase access to education, but if the quality is not up to standard, it's going to be a problem. It's not clear that you're going to get that return to your investment. Similarly with health. And so, as I think the first session of today showed, and as we will see as we go through the conference, there's many more papers looking at the South Africa subjective well-being. Dory's got a very nice paper tomorrow looking at what South Africans have thought about their changes over time. And that's very interesting. And so there's lots of scope for more detailed work to drill down and try and understand it. And I think the issue on the table is really that we can make a contribution to understanding the micro foundations, if you like, of inclusive growth, or the lack of inclusive growth, through detailed work of the sort of comparative studies. There is no general theory of what makes growth more or less inclusive. You can draw some simple diagrams and you can show growth is important for poverty reduction. The less your inequality, the more inclusive your growth is going to be. Those are just diagrams. What is the social fabric that really drives that? Well, I think in our dialogues between Ghana and South Africa, we started asking good questions of each other and started trying to understand the micro foundations of the relationship between growth and poverty and inequality. Thanks.